Canadians have known Justin Trudeau in one way, shape, or form since he was born on December 25th, 1971. His father was prime minister at the time, had been for a little over 3 years, but Trudeau really introduced himself to the country politically in October 2000 when he delivered a eulogy at his father's funeral.
The woods are lovely, dark and deep. He has kept his promises and earned his sleep. Shoot them above.
From that speech, from that moment onwards, people began whispering about a potential political career for Justin Trudeau. And in 2008, he was elected as the MP for the Montreal riding of Papineau. He didn't exactly set the world on fire as a backbench MP, but in March 2012, something else happened. He won a boxing match against Conservative Senator Patrick Brazeau that helped launch his leadership bid, which led to him becoming prime minister in 2015.
Gentlemen, together please. In the second round of this 3-round, 2-minute battle, the referee stopped the fight in favor of, in the red corner, Justin Papineau, pugilist Trudeau.
Now, strangely and bizarrely, considering how big of a critic I am of Justin Trudeau, I was there for both events. Hello, I'm Brian Lilly. Welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. Today, we're speaking with Stephen Marr, longtime journalist and author, about his new book on Justin Trudeau titled The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Stephen joins me now from Ottawa. Normally rests his perch in Nova Scotia, but he's in Ottawa. Thanks for the time, Stephen.
I'm so happy to be with you, Brian.
Tell me about the name The Prince. Are you making a Machiavellian reference there, or is it a reference to the fact that, you know, he's the son of a former prime minister?
It's not Machiavellian, although I've maybe clouded things by quoting Machiavelli in the book. It comes from, I first started thinking of him that way before he was a member of Parliament. The first time I met him was in a bar called Darcy McGee's in Ottawa, which I believe you may have polished with your elbows at one time or another.
Once or twice, yes.
Yeah. And it was a hangout at the time for political people. He popped in there. I think he may have been in Ottawa for a Katimavik board meeting. And he was with his friend Gerald Butts, who's a Cape Bretoner. And I said, oh, geez, that's Justin Trudeau. I'm a reporter. I should go talk to him. And I had a pleasant chat with him and was impressed by how friendly and open he was. And we had a pleasant beer together. And at one point, we were talking politics, and I started to talk about prime ministers. And I mentioned his father in passing, and of course Trudeau did this. And I stopped myself and said, oh, geez, I just realized I'm talking about your father, right? It's a bit odd. And he squared his shoulders and looked at me and said, I never forget I'm a Trudeau. And he struck me at that moment as a sort of regal sort of character. And I thought, this person is different from most of the people that I meet. So over the years, I kind of thought of him as a prince. I used it as a sort of frame to analyze his subsequent behavior. And when I started working on the book, I had that idea in mind that he was a prince with princely characteristics, princely confidence and courage, but princely capriciousness and vanity. Then when I was doing the research, reading through old quotes and so on, I found examples of his brother, his mother, and his wife all calling him a prince. So I became sure as I went along that it was a useful frame of reference for thinking about him.
Well, most of us don't get the chance to launch our political career because our father dies and it's televised across the country. We're not giving a eulogy for our parents on national TV. So, you know, in many ways, you are right. He was he was born when his father occupied 24 Sussex Drive, a place he hasn't lived, by the way, since he became prime minister. That's another story that maybe we'll get into. But how far back did you go in terms of talking to people that knew him? I mean, did you go back to grade school pals of his?
No, I'm interested in him. It's not a story of his life. It's a story of his government. I'm interested in him as a politician because he's a public official, and it's sort of, in the public interest to examine him as a way of understanding our democracy. So I look at his childhood and so on as it kind of impacts his character because he's a public official. So I'm not trying to do the kind of deep dive that you would do if you were
A biography
really
sort of thing.
trying to capture. Yeah, I don't consider it a biography. People are calling it that, but I think it's fair to call it a political biography. I'm trying to tell the story of Justin Trudeau, the politician.
So you spent a lot of time talking to him. I believe the number that I've seen quoted is more than 200 friends, associates, and others that you spoke to in the book. Am I wrong in saying that prior to his being elected, that speech, that eulogy for his father, and that boxing match were two of the catalysts that put him in there? Because you do talk about the boxing match quite a bit and describe how right after that they went into, okay, let's plan for this. So are those two key moments in his political career?
Oh, I think so, very much. And the boxing match was very important. I have a quote in the book from a University of Toronto sociologist who said that the boxing match helped him go from being precariously masculine to sufficiently masculine.
I did read that, yes.
And I think she's on to something there, because until then there was a sort of idea that he was lightweight and kind of feminine sort of character, with long hair and a bit of a showboat. Some people even called him Shiny Pony. I don't know if you remember that.
I may have sat next to the guy, as you recall. I was doing the play-by-play, and the guy sitting next to me doing the color commentary kept calling him Shiny Pony. I mean, it really did seal the deal for a lot of liberals that, oh, we can get behind this guy now. There were some that were behind him just for the name. And especially people of that generation that really loved and admired his father because they lived through his time in ways that you and I are a bit younger and did not to the same degree. So we don't have the same nostalgia. But for others, I think, that boxing match made people say,
Yeah, I remember Andrew Potter writing something about it, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we're basically a nation of lumberjacks, and so the guy who wins the fist fight, there's a sort of primitive part of Canadians who would say, "Oh, well, that was a good scrap. He did a good job there." But I think it actually showed some personal qualities. It showed his courage, right? That's a brave thing to do. And also his self-knowledge. He told me when I interviewed him for the book that he knew all along he was going to win. He was well trained. Likely his trainers would have indicated that he would have a good chance against this guy. Brazo might have been a good karate fighter, but they weren't having a karate fight. They were having a boxing match.
And Brazo was also smoking a pack or two a day back then.
Yeah, which I think is... He must be disappointed in that, but although I've spoken to Brazo a number of times about the fight, and he thinks it was a positive thing for him. Although he had troubles in his personal life later, he doesn't think that really had anything to do with it, and he was pleased that they raised money for a charity dear to his heart, cancer. Which
it's a weird thing, and I'm going to tell a story that I haven't told people. I don't think I've told this in a public forum before. But, if Justin Trudeau's boxing match is responsible in part for him being prime minister, then I'm responsible in part for Justin Trudeau being prime minister, because this was a sleepy charity event that had been going on in Ottawa for years. And back when the Sun News Network was still going and I was a host, I'm sitting in the makeup chair one day, and Stefania Capavia, who cut Trudeau's hair, cut my hair, did the makeup, did Patrick Brazo's hair. And he had told her he's doing this boxing match and he's having trouble finding someone to fight, but he wanted to raise money for cancer. And she said, "Oh, I know a guy," and introduced him to Trudeau. So she tells me that she set this up. I hear about it. I walk into Corey Tonick's office, who was the VP at Quebec or in charge of Sun News. And I said, Justin Trudeau's going to box Patrick Brazeau. And he jumped up and he said, we'll broadcast it like it's the moon landing. And we put it on national TV. It was our highest rated event ever. But, it was weeks and weeks leading up to it of people in print, on radio and TV talking about it. It was a real turning point for Trudeau.
It was hugely important. And it shows something about the guy, I think, that, he believes in himself. And in the book, I have a quote from a former cabinet minister who will remain nameless, who said, if we all had his self-confidence, it's like a superpower. Goodness knows what we could accomplish. And I believe that self-confidence that he has comes from his very unusual childhood and his experience of life. So he is a separate sort of person, a different person than most of the people we've met in our lives.
So I've heard various descriptions. The polls are not good for him right now. I think that's an understatement. They're horrible for him. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've heard the same stories that I have, that people close to him, either politically or family or friends, have said, I think maybe you should think about leaving. And he hasn't. And one of the stories that I've heard back is that he sees it like the boxing match, or like 2015, when everyone underestimated him. And he thinks that he can just, power through, that he's being underestimated now, and that he can win the next election campaign. Given your overarching view of him, would you put any stock in that? Do you think that is part of his psyche at the moment? I
don't presume to know what's going on in his mind. What I do know, though, is that he is trapped in a message box. Until the moment that he decides to take a walk in the snow to announce that he's moving on, he cannot afford to show weakness. He cannot afford to let on that he's thinking about it, even to the people who are quite close to him. Because the minute that people sense that he may leave, his life gets more difficult. The old saying in politics, your opponents are across from you and your enemies sit behind you. Right, so he can't afford to let on his plans, and I think given the circumstances, I think he's got to be looking hard at leaving. But until he does, I don't think we'll know it. And one of the things about him is that he's been subject to unusual scrutiny since childhood, almost like Shirley Temple or Danny Bonaducci. He was like a child star in a sense, and so he has developed the ability to be guarded and to project, a mask, much more so, I think, than most politicians. So I don't think we'll see it coming until he decides.
Well, I mean, you say that we won't see it coming until he decides politically. We had heard for years about troubles in his marriage, and I'd heard them so often, just like I'd heard them about Stephen Harper and his wife before that I discounted them. And I just said, look, marriage is tough. Anybody that's been in one knows that. We'll find out when we find out. And then last August, he announced that it was over. You write a bit about that and the fact that, if he had decided to leave, he could have saved his marriage. Why did he stick around?
Well, I don't know that he could have saved his marriage. I know that, so what I write is the people who know him think that. People who know and admire him. So it's a kind of a nice thing to say about him. While we put the country over his marriage. So why did he stick around is a good question. When I started writing the book, I started writing it in October 2022, and just about every conversation I had with liberals while I was writing this book, the subject of Justin's future would come up. And I noticed that from then until now, there has been a shift in that at that time, there were still a lot of people saying, well, we don't know whether he can win or not, but he's probably our best horse. right? The guy is a
Mhm.
heck of a campaigner. He's got great name recognition, and he knows how to do it, and we should stick with him. I am hearing less of that now, right? There's something about that steady month after month drag of being behind Polyev in the polls that I think has been chipping away at that idea. So it may have looked to him at that time like he was the best hope for the party. Um, and he had not, at that point, it had not been that long since he just won a fresh election, right? To me, a moment where what happened actually after the manuscript was finished, this budget that looked to me like a fairly effective budget, effectively sold, and it doesn't move the polls.
You mean effective politically?
Yes, I don't mean, although I would say that the housing stuff, I've talked to housing developers about this, he is going to cause the construction of a lot of rental units in this country, and we need them, right? So that part, I think, just on a policy basis for generational fairness and that kind of thing, we need that. There's other things that are, partisans can argue one way or another. But politically, policy, and it was they leaked it very professionally beforehand, or not leaked it, but did a bunch of announcements, and they tried to milk it for all it was worth. And you look at the polls, and they get nothing out of it, right? So if you're them, you have to start thinking, well, this is starting to look pretty tough, right? We have a message. Maybe it's the messenger.
I mean, the latest poll from Leger, who it was a Leger poll for Post Media. We partner with them once a month, just like Canadian Press does. Not only is it a 19-point lead for the Conservatives nationally, but the Conservatives are tied with the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. 29-29, and Trudeau and his Liberals are in third at 26.
Tabarouette.
I
That is not good news for the Liberal Party of Canada right there. No.
I don't expect a huge breakthrough. I know some people always get in their ears around election time and tell the Conservatives, oh, you're going to win 20 seats. You're going to win 25 seats. If they get 15, I think they'll be doing well. But Trudeau says, look, Quebec is my home province. I'm a Quebecer. This is, I know this place. And it's done very well for him. He's got 35 seats there right now, I believe. At all three elections, even when other parts of the country said no to him, Quebec said yes. That's got to hurt.
Oh, it's very bad. I was curious. I saw that poll today, and it made my eyebrows pop up. I'd like to look at the gender breakdown. I've long thought that the last constituency the Liberals should ever lose would be Francophone women in Quebec. They're very important. They saved Canada in the referendum, and they saved the Liberal Party over and over again. So I'd like to see the gender breakdown. But that's, he's widely thought to be the best pollster in Canada. And I thought that poll today is another significant bit of bad news for the Trudeau operation. One thing I would say, and it's a tiny little asterisk, is I have found over time that Quebecers tend to be more volatile during election periods because they don't follow federal politics as closely as people in Ontario do. If you read La Presse or Le Journal de Montréal every day, they tend to be dominated by provincial and city news.
I used to work for Quebecor.
Yeah, I don't have to tell you.
So,
right?
yeah, for people that aren't in Quebec, and I also worked in Montreal, in Ontario and in certain other parts of the country, federal politics dominates. In Quebec and in other parts of the country, it's you're right, it's provincial. And I remember sharing an office with Ray Fillion, the longtime reporter on Parliament Hill for
Fine gentleman,
PBA.
Ray Fillion. Yep.
Great guy. He had trouble getting on TV some days.
Right.
There'd be big stories in Ottawa, and they're like, yeah, but the junior minister of whatever in Quebec City said this. Okay. So they don't follow it. You're right.
And so that means that between election polls in Quebec are a little less. I'm not saying it's not significant, but that really came into focus for me during the Orange Wave in 2011, when suddenly Quebecers said, "Wait, who's this Jack Layton guy?" And all decided en masse, "Oh, let's go with him." These kind of swings can happen in Quebec because they're not paying attention the rest of the time. That's my theory, anyway.
If you had to guess right now, if an election were held now, what would you say?
Right now, what the polls say, a Poilievre majority. But I think he is as yet untested, right? Until you see someone in a federal race, you look at, I don't know if you saw the Nanos poll a while ago that found that people have sort of mixed feelings about him. And we're going to have to see. I mean, you and I both know that personally he could not be any nicer, but he has a reputation as kind of a ferocious character, and we'll have to see if Canadians like that when they see it in an election campaign, when they're paying attention.
So I've got 3 rules about Canadian politics. Voters are fickle, polls can change, campaigns matter. Justin Trudeau won government last time, just like he did in 2019, by not winning the popular vote, but he won in the right places. So he got more seats than the Conservatives with just 32.6% of the vote. Do you see a way? And I never count out the Liberals, and I agree with you that Trudeau was a strong campaigner. He won last time by scaring suburban mothers in the Greater Toronto area suburbs and in the Greater Vancouver area suburbs. He scared suburban mothers that if you vote Conservative, look at what's happening in Alberta, your kid's going to get COVID and die. That was a big part of it. So do you see a way that he could scrounge back to 32 over the next year and a bit?
I find it hard to imagine that. And I would say that election, I agree with you that was the sort of winning message. But I would say that divisions on the Conservative side made it difficult for O'Toole to take the kind of position on COVID that he wanted to take. And those divisions will not be present, I don't believe, in the next election. I think Poilievre has the caucus behind him in a way that O'Toole did not.
Yeah, I think you're right on that.
And so I think that they will be stronger and more formidable. It's hard to imagine an issue that would cleave the country in the same way that the Liberals were able to cleave it in 2021 with mandates. I remember Nick Couval saying to me, well, 40% of people in Ontario are in favor of mandates. So there's your election right there. That's what the Liberals were looking at, the same polls, right?
Yep.
But the one thing I'll say is we don't know if Trudeau's going to be the candidate. If Trudeau is not the candidate, if he decides to make way for someone else, or if his inner circle puts the muscle on him and gives him the message that he's got to go, things could change. Because right now, I think the next election would be a referendum on Justin Trudeau. And if he's no longer there, the Conservatives would need to find a new ballot question. And the Liberals might be able to put more scrutiny on Poilievre, right? So it's. I'm not saying that it would that would allow the Liberals to save their bacon, but it just becomes less predictable. I think the current Conservatives now have an excellent plan for how to defeat Justin Trudeau, and he's got so much baggage that he personifies that another candidate might not carry all that baggage.
All right, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about where Trudeau fits in the Liberal sphere of things, but also you've got some interesting insights on a few incidents that happened, including blackface and how that went down. We ran an excerpt of that in National Post. We'll talk about that when we come back. Stephen, one of the things that I want to ask you about is Justin Trudeau, he's had this alliance. I call it a coalition because, there's no NDP ministers, but you've got a working agreement. It's a coalition of sorts with the NDP. But that came about, I felt, after a couple of elections where Justin Trudeau tried to outflank the NDP, much like Kathleen Wynne had tried to do in Ontario. And I've long thought that Justin's political center doesn't lie at Canada's political center. It probably lies closer to the NDP. And it reminds me of a famous quote. Judy Lamarche, who'd been a minister in the Pearson government, was caught on a hot mic during the 1968 Liberal Leadership Convention, trying to convince other candidates to stay in the race against Pierre Trudeau, saying, he's not a liberal, he's a damn socialist. You got to stay in the race. Is Justin Trudeau a classic liberal, or is he a damn socialist?
Well, I think that there's, if you take a step back from just Justin Trudeau and look at the way politics has been trending in Canada and around the world, the Liberals, when in 1968, when Pierre took over that party, were a brokerage party. Very similar to the Progressive Conservative Party, but they were just a more successful brokerage party in that they generally sort of tried to make deals and keep ethnic and religious peace in the country. And a lot of people had connections to politics through patronage networks in one way or another. And Canadian politics was remarkable for being not very ideological. You had this big sort of centrist Liberal Party that kind of shuffled along, normally running the country, and every now and then the Tories would get in for a little while. And but the big issues tended not to be along ideological lines. And gradually, we've seen the center has fallen away, and our politics, partly I think as a result of fragmentation of the media, has become more ideological and more confrontational. So I'm kind of giving a mealy-mouthed answer. I mean, yes, it's a more left-wing government than previous Liberal governments, but I think that the reason for that may have to do with historical trends. And the thing that I'll point to as evidence of that is the decline of the provincial Liberal parties. When I started covering politics in Canada, there were Liberal parties either in government or opposition in a lot of the provinces. And now that is much less the case. They're not in opposition in either Ontario or Quebec. They're finished and gone in BC. They're hanging on in the Maritimes.
They don't really exist west of the Ontario-Manitoba border.
No, and the way things are going, both Ontario and Quebec, the next government in both those provinces may not be a Liberal government, right? Like they're no longer. I would kind of think Bonnie Crombie might be premier one day, but they're trailing in Quebec, and
so you think out of necessity they've moved to the left, as opposed to that, because when Chrétien was so successful, he'd sit there and basically say, well, I'm being attacked from the right and I'm being attacked from the left, so I must be doing the right thing. Justin Trudeau can hardly say he's being attacked from the left these days. Jagmeet Singh will stand up and give a good speech and then vote for him or vote with him.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And Chrétien, I mean, you look at the way he responded to the rise of reform. It was very clever, and that he took basically their best arguments, which were fiscal attacks, and took them to heart and dramatically weakened their electoral prospects by doing what they wanted him to do, in a way. But things have changed, and I could kind of see how electorally it made sense for the Liberals to, they outflanked Tom Mulcair in 2015, promising deficit spending, which was what Canadians wanted. The polls were saying nobody cared about deficits at that time. And since then, they've been kind of edging that way, and it has mostly worked for them. I mean, they're not having a good day at the moment, but the Trudeau government has been quite successful
They won 3
politically.
elections.
Yeah.
So I will regularly have conservative supporters more than conservative elected officials. They'll just say, "Oh, well, Trudeau's dumb," and I say, "Well, he's won 3 elections against the guys that you support. So you've got to have a better argument than that." You mentioned Tom Mulcair, and you've got an interesting little detail in the book about the 2015 campaign. And I've long thought that the kneecap decision in September 2015 was a TSN turning point, as they might say.
Mm-hmm.
This was a major shift. To me, it wasn't just the deficit spending. A court ruling came out that said you could swear your oath of citizenship while having your face covered by a niqab. Stephen Harper came out and said, "We form government, we're going to appeal this." Tom Mulcair came out and said, "This is wrong. The court took the right decision. The Harper government's wrong." Justin Trudeau had the same exact position as Tom Mulcair. And yet Quebecers who had given the NDP, 57 seats in the previous election, turned on Mulcair and switched to Trudeau over the niqab issue. Not solely, but that was a big part of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it was crucial. And I've got an interesting anecdote in the book from Carl Belanger, who had an unnamed conservative he was talking to regularly. He said, "Stop it."
Carl Belanger, for people who don't know, and was a longtime NDP staffer, operative, very well known on the Hill, very respected, worked for Jack Layton, worked for Tom Mulcair. So I'll let you go on from there.
And he had a Tory who he would talk to from time to time, a senior guy on the Harper campaign, who had said, "We want to win, but if we have to lose, we'd rather lose to you than to the Liberals," right? And Carl eventually ends up saying to him, "Well, you're killing us on this niqab thing, right? Stop it. You're going to elect the Liberals." And he said, "No, we're not killing you. Your numbers are holding up." And "No, they're not." And they weren't. So I thought at the time that Harper was trapped playing whack-a-mole, that he was going to lose to either Tom Mulcair or Justin Trudeau in that election, because you could see what Frank Graves calls the promiscuous progressives who wanted to replace Harper and didn't particularly care who was going to do it. And in the course of that campaign, Trudeau emerged as the champion for that part of the country.
Well, and basically, once Quebec moved to Trudeau, the rest of the country, on the progressive side, moved to Trudeau.
I would want to look at the polling, because I was talking to someone not long ago who said that the last piece to fall in place was Quebec. Quebec is what gave them the majority. But I mean, it was volatile there for a while. So I think the Tories made a mistake in hitting it so hard, the niqab thing, and they also had what was the other thing?
The snitch line.
The snitch line, which you take those two things together, and the kind of rhetoric that the Prime Minister was using about national security at the time, the tentacles of the Islamist threat, or it was a little bit different from the kind of campaigns we normally have, and I thought it was a sign that they were in trouble and having to try to rattle people with national security and identity kind of stuff.
I think the niqab issue could have been of benefit to them. It was adding everything else on. If I remember the polling at the time, polling was on side with where the Conservatives were. But you start adding on everything else, you get a lot of noise, you get people with a general sense of unease, and suddenly they're turning your back. It was a strange election. I talked to people who campaigned, and at the beginning of the campaign, they'd show up in, suburban Toronto riding, let's say, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm voting Conservative. Yeah, give me a lawn sign." And then by the end of the campaign, because it went from August to October, And by the end of the campaign, they show up, and there's a Liberal lawn sign, and they're like, "Oh no, I'm not voting for those guys anymore. I'm voting Liberal." It
Yeah.
was a bizarre campaign.
It was. And I agree with you that if you looked at the polling on any one of on the snitch line, on the niqab issue, I would be shocked if the Tories didn't have public support on their side. But you start to put it all together, and eventually people go like, "Yeah, no, I kind of agree with you," but it's kind of weird that you keep talking about all this stuff. Do you know what I mean? It was more a question of tone, I think, than. I think you're right.
So you've got some interesting bits in the book that I hadn't heard before. In fact, I want to play a quick clip here. This is Justin Trudeau doing a scrum with reporters. He had made comments to the effect that he, Stephen Harper wins again, he might become a separatist. And he had to go out against the advice of Liberal communication staffers. He went out and started sounding like George Costanza, talking about himself in the third person. Here he is.
I love this.
Canadians should be outraged. Canadians shouldn't be asking, does Justin Trudeau actually want to separate? Of course not. But will Justin Trudeau fight with his very last breath to make sure that this Canada stays the Canada that we collectively know it can be? Absolutely.
But then what were you saying?
The way you tell the story in the book is that Kevin Bosch and Daniel Lauzon, two longtime experienced Liberals staffers, people who knew how the business of politics worked, had told him, don't go out there. No, do not go and talk to the reporters.
Just let it. We think it's better if you just let it die.
And then he goes out, and if you see the video, there's my former colleague, Jessica Murphy, just off to the side. And I think you know Jessica. And she's trying not to laugh the whole time. So what happened when Trudeau went back into the foyer where Kevin and Daniel are waiting for him?
So he goes back in and he looks at them and he says, "Well, I guess that didn't go very well, did it?" And Bosch says, "Yeah, didn't you used to be a drama teacher?" And Trudeau said, "Yes, not a very good one." So, and this is actually something that I learned as I was researching the book. Early on, he was accident prone. He would make dumb quips from time to time.
He'd call Peter Kent a piece of shit in the House of Commons.
Although I actually think that was worked for him and was smart in a way. As unpleasant as it was for Mr. Kent, who I don't know about you, but I had a lot of respect for the way he conducted himself usually. But he'd taken a cheap shot at Megan Leslie, at my Halifax MP.
Oh, you East Coasters, you stick together.
Well, she's a very nice person. He shouldn't have said something mean about her. Anyway, but when he messed up, when he would say something, a lot of times he would go to his team. The interview would finish, and he'd say, "I shouldn't have said that, should I?" And they'd say, "No. Here's what you should have said." I'd say, "Oh shit, do I?" Well, we'll work it out. So he kept making mistakes, but when he did, he would apologize, and he kept. This is one of the things that's I found impressive, is that he kept working on himself, improving his message discipline, and did that kind of painful work of watching tapes of himself and being critiqued and.
When I first met him, he was just a backbencher who wanted to talk to me because I was with CJD in Montreal and News Talk 1010 in Toronto. So he saw me and he's like, "Oh, local reporter." Much like you did to him, I'm a journalist, I should go talk to him. He came to me because he's like, "Oh, that guy works for the local radio station. I should talk to him." He wasn't really the guy that we see now. So you say he put a lot of work into it.
Yeah, well, his natural speaking style is very different from the style that he has now. It's much breathier, much faster, sort of more emotional. what you see now, and I'm not sure that the result is entirely successful, because he often sounds, sometimes it sounds like he's sort of imitating a Mulroney baritone, which people were sick of when Mulroney was doing it by the end. You know what I mean? It can sound kind of phony, but it's very different from the sort of excited, emotional old Justin. So I give him credit. I mean, just as a person who did all this work to uh, to get better at something that, strangely enough, considering how he used to make his living, he was not that good at.
I always thought he was a good motivational speaker, a good public speaker. I'll be honest, I wished he'd stayed doing that job because I'm not fond of many of his policies. But I will give him credit for, as you say, putting in the work and changing. One thing he's taken a lot of flack for over the years are expensive vacations. The Prospect Estate in Jamaica, you write about. The Corinthia Hotel in London, which, you know, it was $7,000 a night that cost.
I should have put that in the book. I think I missed that one.
He's had a lot of these, but you've got a part in the book that it's kind of weird. How does Justin Trudeau going to Prospect Estate, which is, I think, $9,000 a night? I might be wrong, but it's thousands and thousands of dollars a night to stay there. What does it have to do with diapers?
Right. So he first went there when he was in diapers. While he was small, his mother was desperate for a vacation, and Pierre, being a workaholic, didn't like to take vacations, and she had convinced him that they would have a getaway at the Jamaica Inn in Ocho Rios.
It's kind of weird that he didn't like vacations. He met her on vacation.
Well, or that was what.
The story I heard is he saw her on a beach while, his dad, who was in government with Pierre, they were all vacationing at the same spot, and he's like, who's that young woman in a bikini?
Yeah.
Not to sound creepy, but that's literally what happened.
Yes. And Diefenbaker said the prime minister had a choice. He could have married her or adopted her, referring to the age difference.
All right. So she's desperate for a vacation, wants to go to this place in Ocho Rios in Jamaica. And what happened?
And she calls down and says, well, I just want to make sure that you have a diaper service, because I'm going to be coming with my little newborn, or my child. And they say, oh, goodness, ma'am, we don't have diapers here, because we don't allow babies at this resort. And she was crushed and afraid that if she told Pierre, he would just say, well, I guess we'll stay in Ottawa then. So she had the High Commission in Kingston nose around, and they said, well, there's this other place, Prospect Estate. And so she called there, and without telling Pierre, moved their reservation. And it was owned by a fellow named Sir Harold Mitchell, who's a very impressive and interesting man, who had been an official in Winston Churchill's Conservative Party, and an industrialist, and built, I didn't put this in the book, but he built a boys' school in Jamaica, where a lot of might be the best boys' school in Jamaica. So a sort of charitably minded person. Anyway, and they went and stayed there and became friends with him, and friends with his daughter, who later married a man named Peter Green, and who had a couple sons who became close to the Trudeau boys. And so they would go there quite often, and there would be 5 of them, a little tribe of boys running around. You probably know what that's like from your own family. And so it's a place with really special and happy memories. Trudeau planted a royal palm there. I put a picture in the book that I got from the National Archives in Jamaica of Pierre holding him on a coconut tree. So, as I sort of contemplated this, I thought, well, no wonder he wants to go there and share that experience with his kids, right? It's marvelous. It looks like a beautiful place.
But the public doesn't know that, and much like his trip to the Aga Khan Island that you write about, the public doesn't know things, and then they get annoyed. His staff told him, "Don't take this trip to the Aga Khan's Island," or at least those closest to him, like Katie Telford and Jerry Butts. Uh, he ends up coming across, instead of coming across as someone that wants to go back to somewhere he's been going his whole life, he comes across as entitled. He comes across as out of touch. And who the hell is this guy? So does he get that he comes across as an entitled, out of touch, aloof elite?
What he said to me, so when I interviewed him for the book, and I only had one interview, I went into it not planning on grilling him or getting into arguments with him about SNC-Lavalin, or I didn't think that would be productive because I wanted to get his thoughts on a number of different things.
You don't get a good interview like that, despite what people think.
Yeah, during an election campaign on TV, it might be good, but if that's not the way to, I wanted to fill in some gaps for the book. Tell me about this, tell me about that. And I was impressed, Brian. I'll tell you, you and I have both done a lot of interviews. He understood why I was there, and I think he did his best to make it a productive meeting for both of us, if you know what I mean. Like, it was a thing where you go, yeah, the guy knows what he's doing. You know what I mean? He's trying to help me here, he's taking an hour of his time, and he's trying to give me some quotes for my book. But the one thing that I said to him is, I talked to him, asked him about that story, and then I said, okay, well, I should tell you, I'm not trying to argue with you, but I thought that was a mistake, and I'm likely going to write that. And he said, yeah, okay, fair enough. He thought about it for a minute, and he said, he talked about his kids, how hard it is for him to have time with his kids in his job, and said it's an impossible thing it's an impossible balance. So he feels torn, I think, between his responsibilities to his family and his responsibilities to the country. I still think it's a mistake, but
look, if you're going to do it, at least try and explain the context to people.
Yeah. Well, and they told him before the Aga Khan thing, like, okay, if you're really going to do this, then we better have a plan for explaining it. Now, thank goodness for our friends Chris Selly and David Aiken that they didn't, because the boys got a pretty good scoop out of it, didn't they?
Yeah. Tell me about the blackface story. That's the excerpt that we ran in National Post. Walk us through how that happened. I remember hearing during the day before the story broke. I don't know about you, but the way the media business works, you start hearing chatter. Oh, somebody's got something. Something big's coming. Then you hear about the blackface story. Oh, there's more pictures. And he still hasn't spoken. So I guess it was Time Magazine broke it, and then there was claims that there were going to be more. So they released a different picture, and then Global comes out with a third photo that wasn't the one that they released. I think they released the second one thinking that's the one Global must have. That had to be incredibly difficult. So how did he and his team deal with that?
It was an incredibly stressful thing for Trudeau and his people. It broke while he was campaigning in my hometown of Truro, Nova Scotia, where what should be, in normal circumstances, a Tory seat, but they had a good candidate there, former provincial MLA Lenore Zan, and Trudeau had gone in to try to get her over the finish line. And she told me, and several other people who were at the rally told me, that he seemed a little bit extra frenetic, extra energetic, and a bit weird, almost, like really hyper. And that appears to be because before the rally, as best as I can figure out the timeline, Ottawa had the call from Time Magazine, and they knew that a bucket of effluent was going to fall on their heads that day. And I often thought if I was in his shoes and they said, well, the blackface pictures are coming out, I'd say, well, let's cancel the rally and let's get some rum. And I'm going to my room, right? Like, good idea why you don't want to be in politics. So he went in there, and he did it, and then the story breaks. He did the rally, story breaks, and they're all on the bus. They take the bus from Truro to Halifax Airport, and the reporters are all freaking out, and they're all in trouble with their desks because Time magazine broke it, and so it's a frantic and unpleasant kind of moment. And then there's a scrum, and he's apologizing. And give him credit, he not once in that whole thing did he try to say, "Well, come on, I was dressed up. It was a costume party," right? Like that, he wouldn't have got through it if he'd tried some kind of half-assed apology, I don't think. So he was abject, and the reporters were all yelling at them. And then the people at home are going like, see pictures of the reporters, and the reporters are all white, right? The whole thing was kind of ugly and unpleasant. And there followed about 24 hours, maybe less than 24 hours, where a bunch of liberals, including a bunch of black liberals, did a gut check, right? How do we feel about this? Are we going to support him or not? And there was a generational divide in some cases, that older black liberals were kind of found it easier to say, well, he was a foolish young fella, but I know racism, and that isn't what it looks like. That's foolishness. We know him. We know he's not like that. Whereas younger people, it was harder. Younger black people would be saying, well, who does that kind of thing? That seems just crazy, right? We know that's, anyway. But the gut checks ended, and they decided they had his back. And he went out and scrummed in Winnipeg until there were no more questions. And
That was a long one.
Yeah, I didn't put it in the book. I thought about writing it. It reminded me of the Jack Layton's massage parlor scrum, where you just think, I'm glad I'm not that guy having to do that scrum. And that's where in a sense, that's the, a very difficult thing about political leadership is how are you going to manage when you're staring down basically a sewer pipe and having to stand there in front of the cameras and eat your shame.
So that would have ended a lot of people. Why do you think it didn't end Trudeau? That didn't end Trudeau. The Kokanee Grope didn't end Trudeau. So many things that would have taken out other politicians. People have been willing to give him a pass. Is it people? Is it the media? Is it a combination?
Look, I mean, it's a specific incident on its individual case, and I think that black liberals decided that Justin Trudeau had been foolish, but not a racist. So I sometimes find, and you get this on social media from people who hate Trudeau for lots of other reasons, and they're seizing on blackface. So, I'm not going to say how the black community should feel about it, right? That's for the black community to decide.
But the black community is not large enough in Canada to decide elections. And even in the United States, where this has ended political careers, it's ended the political careers of people where just black voters voting against that person would not end their career, but their careers have still ended.
Yeah.
So why the difference with Trudeau?
Well, for one thing, it's not the United States. And although we do have the minstrel tradition, and there did used to be minstrel shows in Canada, which is what makes it so horribly painful, right? Is the tradition of blackface as part of a really hateful racist thing. But I don't know anybody who thinks that Trudeau was particularly trying to denigrate the black community by doing what he did. He was he really likes dressing up, right? And as a young man, he was constantly wearing costumes of one sort or another. So I think that part
as
of
a
the
less than
analysis,
young man, he wore a lot of costumes. Ask him about India 2018.
I know. I think they still have to stop him. Likely, well, Prime Minister, maybe not this time. So he's an attention seeker, and so I think that seen in context, and Canadians knew him very well. But there is something unfair about it. If one of his candidates had a blackface, and I write this in the book, if one of his prospective candidates, had a blackface thing in their university yearbook, they would not get a nomination, right? I write in the book, he's a prince, and the rules don't apply to princes. Like, there is something that's unfair about it.
The book is by Stephen Marr. It's called The Prince, The Turbulent Reign of Justin Trudeau. Stephen, thanks so much for the time today. You've been very generous. And I'll say this as someone who has covered Justin Trudeau since 2008. I learned things from reading your book. So I'd encourage others that want to learn more to do the same. Thanks so much.
Brian, thank you for having me on.
All right. Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Help us out by giving us a rating, leaving a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.